The courthouse hallway smelled of polished wood, old paper, and quiet tension. Marcus Reed walked beside his public defender, wrists cuffed in front of him, chains clinking softly with every step. His posture was straight, composed, almost military in discipline. He didn't look around nervously like most defendants did. He walked like a man who knew something others didn't. Across the corridor, Officer Daniel Hargrove leaned casually against the wall, thumbs hooked into his duty belt. His uniform was pressed sharp, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His expression carried the relaxed arrogance of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. To Hargrove, this case wasn't complicated. It was routine. 3 weeks earlier, their paths had crossed during what started as a routine late-night traffic stop. Marcus had been driving home from work when Hargrove pulled him over for a minor lane violation. From the beginning, Marcus had complied. License ready. Registration ready. Hands visible on the wheel. No sudden movements. No attitude. But compliance wasn't what Hargrove had been looking for that night. Control was. Backup arrived within minutes, called in before anything suspicious had even occurred. Flashing lights painted the dark street red and blue as Hargrove ordered Marcus out of the car. Step out. Slowly. Marcus obeyed. He was searched. His car was searched. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing was found. Until Hargrove suddenly called out, "Got something." A small plastic evidence bag appeared in his gloved hand, narcotics, sealed and labeled later at the station. Marcus had stared at it, confusion turning slowly into disbelief. "That's not mine." Hargrove didn't respond. He simply cuffed him, wrote the report, filed the charges, and let the system begin its work. Now, standing outside courtroom 4B, Hargrove pushed himself off the wall and stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough so only Marcus could hear. Should have cooperated better that night. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's eyes. "I did cooperate." Hargrove smirked. "Jury won't see it that way." For a brief moment, silence stretched between them. Marcus's expression didn't change. "You sure about that?" he asked calmly. The question lingered longer than Hargrove expected. Something in Marcus's tone wasn't fear. It was certainty. Before Hargrove could reply, the courtroom doors opened. Case 2147 State Verse, Marcus Reed. They entered. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Wooden benches were partially filled, a few civilians, some media observers, and unfamiliar faces Hargrove didn't recognize. He noticed cameras set along the rear wall. Department documentation, he assumed. Routine publicity recording. Nothing unusual. At the prosecution table, files were stacked neatly, arrest, photos, lab reports, body cam stills, all reinforcing Hargrove's account, because he had made sure they did. Marcus sat beside his attorney, chains clinking softly as he adjusted in his seat. His eyes scanned the room once slow, deliberate, as if confirming someone's presence. Judge Eleanor Whitman entered, robe flowing as everyone rose. "Be seated." Her sharp gaze moved between defendant and officer. "Officer Hargrove, you'll be testifying first." Confidence returned instantly. Hargrove approached the stand, swore the oath, and faced the jury with practiced ease. His report was airtight, his testimony rehearsed, and the badge on his chest, as always, felt like armor. Untouchable. What he didn't know was that multiple cameras in that courtroom were recording for reasons far beyond standard procedure. And somewhere in the gallery, an unmarked federal investigator quietly pressed record. The sting had already begun. The oath still echoed in the courtroom as Officer Daniel Hargrove settled into the witness stand. He adjusted the microphone slightly, posture confident, shoulders squared. Testifying wasn't new to him. In fact, he'd done it dozens of times. Traffic violations, narcotics arrests, assault cases. The system trusted his word. and that trust had never failed him. "State your name and badge number for the record," the prosecutor began. "Officer Daniel Hargrove. Badge 4172. His voice was steady, professional, rehearsed, without sounding rehearsed. The prosecutor paced slowly before the jury. "Walk us through the night of March 14th. Hargrove nodded once. It began as a routine traffic stop. The defendant was driving erratically, drifting between lanes. Marcus, seated at the defense table, didn't react, didn't interrupt. He simply watched. Hargrove continued. "I approached the vehicle and observed suspicious behavior. The defendant appeared nervous, avoided eye contact, and made furtive movements toward the center console. Marcus's attorney scribbled notes, but remained silent. Based on my training and experience," Hargrove went on, "I called for backup and asked the defendant to step out of the vehicle." The prosecutor stopped pacing. "And did he comply?" "Yes," Hargrove admitted, careful to maintain credibility. But his behavior remained suspicious. He described the search next: methodical, detailed, confident. Then came the key moment. "During the vehicle search, I discovered a plastic bag containing a controlled substance concealed beneath the driver's seat." The prosecutor approached the evidence table and lifted the sealed bag. "Is this the substance you recovered?" Hargrove leaned forward, glancing at it briefly. "Yes, it is. Let the record reflect. The witness has identified the evidence." Jurors watched closely. Some nodded slightly. From the surface, the narrative was clean, logical, convincing. The prosecutor smiled faintly. "And how did the defendant respond when you placed him under arrest?" "He became verbally defensive," Hargrove said. "Claimed the substance wasn't his." A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Marcus remained still, calm, almost detached. The prosecutor finished confidently. No further questions. Judge Whitman turned. "Defense?" Marcus's attorney, Linda Carver, rose slowly, measured, composed. She approached the stand with a thin folder in hand. "Officer Hargrove," she began, voice calm but precise. "How long have you been with the department?" 12 years. "Commendations?" "Several." "Any disciplinary actions?" Hargrove hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Minor procedural reviews. Nothing sustained." Carver nodded as if satisfied. Then she asked, "Your body camera, it was active that night?" "Yes." "And the footage shows the discovery of the substance?" "It documents the search, yes." Carver paused, just long enough to shift the air in the room. "Interesting," she said softly. Hargrove's jaw tightened slightly. "Why is that?" She held his gaze. "Because the footage we received has a 7-minute gap, precisely during the time you claim the substance was found." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Hargrove's confidence didn't break, but it flickered. "Technical malfunction," he replied quickly. Carver nodded again. Calm, prepared. "Of course," she said. "No further questions, for now." As she returned to the defense table, Marcus leaned slightly toward her. Hargrove watched them. For the first time since taking the stand, something unfamiliar pressed at the edges of his certainty. Not fear, but pressure. And in the back row of the courtroom, a federal investigator quietly noted the timestamp Carver had just mentioned. Because that missing 7 minutes was exactly where the trap had been set. The courtroom felt heavier after the body cam revelation. Not explosive, not yet, but something had shifted. Officer Daniel Hargrove stepped down from the witness stand, jaw tight, expression controlled. He'd handled tougher cross-examinations before. A missing body cam segment wasn't ideal, but it wasn't fatal either. Technical issues happened. Jurors understood that. Still, as he returned to the prosecution table, he couldn't ignore the quiet murmurs echoing from the gallery. Defense attorney Linda Carver didn't sit immediately. She remained standing. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense would like to call its first witness, Judge Whitman nodded. Proceed. Carver turned toward the courtroom doors. The defense calls Mr. Elijah Turner. The name meant nothing to Hargrove at first, but when the doors opened, his posture subtly stiffened. Elijah Turner walked in wearing a dark grey suit, older man, late 52nds, posture disciplined, movements precise. Not nervous, not intimidated. He took the stand calmly, swore the oath, and sat. Carver approached. Mr. Turner, where were you on the night of March 14th? I was parked across the street from the traffic stop, Turner said clearly. Hargrove's brow furrowed. A bystander witness? Routine. Carver continued. And why were you there? I was conducting observational field documentation. The phrasing caught attention. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Documentation for what purpose? Carver asked. Turner answered without hesitation. I work as a contracted civilian investigator for a federal civil rights oversight task unit. Silence dropped into the courtroom like weight. Hargrove's fingers curled slowly against the table. Carver let the words settle before speaking again. Did you record the traffic stop? Yes. The prosecutor stood instantly. Objection. We've received no such footage in discovery. Carver didn't even look at him. It was submitted this morning, Your Honor, following authentication clearance. Judge Whitman checked the clerk's desk, then nodded. Overruled. Continue. For the first time, Hargrove felt something cold move down his spine. Carver stepped closer to the witness. Mr. Turner, what exactly did your recording capture? Turner looked briefly toward Marcus, then back at the jury. It captured the entire search. A pause, without interruption. The words landed harder than any shout. Hargrove's mind raced instantly back to that night, to angles, shadows, blind spots, to where he believed he stood unseen. Carver spoke again, voice steady but sharp now. Does your footage show Officer Hargrove discovering the substance naturally? Turner held her gaze. No. The gallery erupted into whispers before the gavel slammed. Order! Judge Whitman's eyes locked onto the witness. Clarify your statement. Turner did. The footage shows Officer Hargrove removing a small plastic bag from his own patrol vehicle and placing it beneath the defendant's seat before announcing its discovery. The air left the room. Completely. Hargrove didn't move. Couldn't. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. Carver delivered the final blow calmly. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to play the footage. Judge Whitman didn't hesitate. Granted. Lights dimmed slightly as the courtroom monitor flickered on. Hargrove stared at the screen, realizing too late that the 7 missing minutes from his body cam weren't missing at all. They'd just been recorded by someone else. And now the sting was about to unfold in front of everyone. The courtroom lights dimmed just enough for the monitor at the front to glow brighter. Every eye shifted toward the screen. Officer Daniel Hargrove felt his throat tighten as the footage loaded. He kept his expression still. Years of courtroom appearances had trained him well. But inside, calculation replaced confidence. Angles, distance, timing. He tried to remember exactly where the bystander vehicle had been parked. Too late now. The video began. Grainy at first nighttime street lighting, flashing patrol lights painting the scene in red and blue pulses. The timestamp read, March 14, 11:40, 2 p.m. Marcus's car sat pulled over. Hargrove approached the driver's side exactly as he'd testified. The footage had clear audio. License and registration. Marcus's calm voice responded compliantly. The jury watched silently as the routine stop unfolded. Step-out request, pat-down, back-up arrival. So far, everything aligned with Hargrove's report. The prosecutor exhaled quietly, momentarily reassured. Then the angle shifted. The camera zoomed slightly from across the street, clearer now, stabilized. It showed Hargrove walking back toward his patrol car, while Marcus stood near the curb with another officer. Hargrove glanced around. Left. Right. Checking. The courtroom grew stiller. On screen, he opened his patrol door, reached inside, and removed a small plastic evidence bag. A visible ripple passed through the gallery. Hargrove's jaw locked. The footage continued merciless, unblinking. He palmed the bag low against his vest, shielding it from the other officer's line of sight. Then he walked back toward Marcus's vehicle. Defense attorney Carver didn't look at the screen. She watched Hargrove instead. The video showed him kneeling beside the open driver's door, his body blocking the view for a moment. But when he shifted, the motion was clear. His hands slid beneath the seat. Placed the bag. He stood, paused, then called out, "Got something." Gasps erupted across the courtroom before the judge's gavel slammed repeatedly. Order! Order! But the damage was done. Jurors stared at the screen in stunned silence. Some leaned forward. Others shook their heads slowly. The video replayed the moment in slow zoom, the plant, the concealment, the staged discovery. Every frame precise, undeniable. Hargrove felt heat rise under his collar. His earlier testimony echoed in his mind. Confident, detailed, false. The prosecutor's face had gone pale. Carver finally spoke, voice cutting clean through the silence. "Your Honor, the defense submits this footage as Exhibit D evidence of deliberate evidence, tampering and false arrest." Judge Whitman's expression had hardened into something cold and judicially precise. She looked directly at Hargrove. "Officer, is there any explanation you'd like to offer before this court proceeds?" For the first time since this case began, Daniel Hargrove had none. Words didn't come. Training didn't help. Authority didn't shield him. Because now, the power he trusted was watching him collapse on record. And in the back row, federal investigators quietly began standing, preparing to move as the courtroom realization fully set in. The sting wasn't just exposure anymore. It was about to become an arrest. Silence filled the courtroom, heavy, suffocating, absolute. The footage had stopped playing, but its impact lingered in the air like smoke after an explosion. Officer Daniel Hargrove remained seated at the prosecution table, eyes fixed forward, but unfocused as if his mind hadn't fully caught up to what had just happened. Moments earlier, he had been the state's primary witness. Now he was the center of a federal crime. Judge Whitman adjusted her glasses slowly, reviewing the submitted exhibit on her bench monitor, once more methodical, precise, making sure what she'd seen was real and admissible. When she finally spoke, her voice carried controlled authority. "Officer Hargrove, please stand." He rose automatically, training overriding shock. The judge's gaze hardened. "You testified under oath that the substance recovered from the defendant's vehicle was discovered during a lawful search." "Yes, Your Honor," he answered, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. She turned her monitor slightly. "This footage shows you retrieving the substance from your patrol unit and placing it inside the vehicle prior to announcing its discovery." A pause. "Do you dispute the authenticity of this recording?" Hargrove swallowed. His attorney hadn't even spoken yet, stunned like everyone else. I would need to review." "That won't be necessary." Her gavel struck once. Sharp. Final. "This court finds probable cause of evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations." A wave of murmurs erupted again. But this time, the shock wasn't about Marcus. It was about the badge. Before Hargrove could react, movement stirred in the gallery. 3 individuals in dark suits stood simultaneously from the back row posture, formal, expressions unreadable. They walked forward with calm authority. One of them produced a badge wallet, flipping it open. Federal Internal Affairs Oversight Division. The words landed like concrete. Hargrove's pulse spiked instantly. The lead investigator stopped beside him. "Officer Daniel Hargrove, You are being placed under federal investigation for civil rights violations, falsification of evidence, and obstruction of justice. The prosecutor stepped back instinctively, distancing himself. Hargrove looked around, almost searching for departmental backup, for someone to intervene. No one did, because this authority outranked his own. "Turn around, sir." For the first time in 12 years on the force, Daniel Hargrove hesitated at a command. "Now," the investigator repeated. Slowly, mechanically, he complied. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than any gavel had that day. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Minutes earlier, he had testified against Marcus Reed. Now he stood cuffed in the very courtroom where he'd expected vindication. Across the room, Marcus watched quietly, not with satisfaction, not with anger. Just stillness, dignity intact. Judge Whitman addressed the court. "All charges against the defendant are hereby suspended pending full review." Another gavel strike. Court is in recess. As federal agents escorted Hargrove toward the exit, cameras from the gallery snapped photos, rapidly capturing the moment power collapsed under truth. And for the first time since the arrest, the man who had been framed walked out of the courtroom unchained, while the officer who framed him left in cuffs. By the time Daniel Hargrove was escorted out of the courthouse, the story had already begun spreading. Not quietly, explosively. Outside the courthouse steps, media vans lined the street, reporters speaking urgently into cameras, production crews scrambling for angles. Someone inside the courtroom had leaked the footage within minutes, and once it hit the press networks, control was gone. As federal agents guided Hargrove down the courthouse stairs in handcuffs, camera shutters erupted in rapid flashes. "Officer Hargrove, did you plant the evidence? Do you deny the footage? Were there other victims?" The questions came like gunfire. Hargrove kept his head forward, jaw clenched, but the humiliation burned deeper with every step. Hours earlier, he had entered the building through the front doors, respected, uniformed, untouchable. Now he exited through the same doors, cuffed, disgraced, a symbol reversed. Across the street, Marcus Reed stood beside his attorney, watching silently as the scene unfolded. He wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating. Freedom hadn't fully settled in yet. Not after 3 weeks in custody for a crime he hadn't committed. Linda Carver spoke quietly beside him. "This is just the beginning." Marcus nodded once. He knew, because cases like this didn't end with one arrest. They expanded. Back at the police department, the fallout hit like a shockwave. The precinct briefing room had been called into emergency session. Officers filled the space, tension thick as command staff entered. Captain Raymond Holt placed a tablet on the table without a word. He tapped the screen. The courtroom footage played on the wall monitor. No commentary needed. The room went silent except for the audio of Hargrove planting the evidence. Some officers looked down. Others stared in disbelief. One muttered under his breath, "Dumb." Holt paused the video at the exact frame where the bag touched the car floor. "This footage is now under federal review," he said firmly. "Effective immediately, Officer Hargrove is suspended pending criminal investigation." A hand rose from the back. "Sir, Internal Affairs?" Holt's expression darkened. "Federal Internal Affairs. This is above departmental jurisdiction now." That answer landed heavily, because federal oversight meant one thing. They weren't just investigating Hargrove. They were investigating the system around him. Holt continued. "All prior arrests involving Officer Hargrove are being reopened for evidence review." That shifted the room's energy instantly. Years of cases, dozens of convictions, now all under scrutiny. Meanwhile, news channels replayed the courtroom footage on loop. Headlines rolled. "Officer caught planting evidence in courtroom sting." "Federal probe launched after civil rights violation." "Wrongfully charged defendant freed." Public outrage surged online. Civil rights groups issued statements within hours. Protests began organizing by nightfall, and in a federal office miles away, investigators began pulling sealed files connected to Hargrove's badge number. Because the sting hadn't been random, Marcus Reed hadn't been the first target. He had been the one that finally exposed the pattern. And as investigators built the wider case, one truth became clear. Daniel Hargrove's arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was the door that had just opened. The federal interrogation room was colder than any courtroom Daniel Hargrove had ever stood in. Not physically, psychologically. Grey walls, metal table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. No badge, no belt, no authority. Just him and the weight of the footage that had already gone public. He sat alone for nearly 12 minutes before the door opened. 2 federal investigators entered Special Agent Carla Ruiz and Oversight Prosecutor Daniel Mercer. They didn't rush, didn't posture. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than intimidation ever could. Ruiz placed a thin case file on the table and sat across from him. Mercer remained standing near the wall, arms folded. "Officer Hargrove," Ruiz began calmly, "you understand why you're here." Hargrove leaned back slightly, defensive posture returning out of habit. "I've already requested legal representation." "You'll have it," Ruiz said, "but this is your opportunity to cooperate before formal charges expand." "Expand?" he repeated. That word landed heavier than he expected. Ruiz opened the file slowly, deliberately turning it so he could see. Inside were photographs, different arrests, different suspects, same officer, same pattern. She slid the first photo forward. A young black male, early 20s. Case dismissed. Evidence contamination. Next photo. Middle-aged man. Conviction overturned last year. Another. Teenager. Charges dropped due to procedural error. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "You think I remember every arrest I've made?" Ruiz didn't react. "We don't expect memory," she said. "We rely on pattern." She tapped the file. 6 reopened cases so far. Mercer finally spoke from the wall. "All involving narcotics recovered during vehicle searches." Silence stretched. Ruiz leaned forward slightly. "The Reed case triggered federal monitoring because prior complaints had already flagged your conduct. That caught his attention. Complaints don't mean guilt." "No," she agreed. "But corroborated video evidence does." She slid a tablet across the table. On screen, another clip began playing. Not the Reed footage. A different traffic stop. Different suspect. But the same movement pattern. Patrol car. Retrieval. Placement. Hargrove's breathing slowed, controlled, but heavier now. "You're building narratives," he said quietly. Ruiz met his eyes. "We're building charges." She let that settle, then delivered the pressure point. "Perjury alone carries federal prison exposure. Add civil rights violations, falsified evidence, wrongful incarceration." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mercer stepped closer. "Cooperation reduces sentencing exposure." "There's nothing to cooperate about," Hargrove snapped. Ruiz closed the file calmly. "That's your choice." She stood. But before leaving, she paused beside him. "One more thing." She placed a final photograph on the table. Marcus Reed in court, calm, dignified, cleared. "He wasn't random," Ruiz said quietly. "He was the case we monitored in real time." Hargrove looked up sharply. Realization clicked too late. "You were already under surveillance before that stop," she continued. "The sting didn't start in the courtroom." She let the truth land fully. "It started with you." The door closed behind them, leaving Hargrove alone again. But this time, silence didn't feel like control. It felt like collapse. Because for the first time since putting on the badge, he wasn't being protected by the system. He was being dismantled by it. Marcus Reed stepped out of the federal courthouse into open daylight for the first time as a free man. But freedom didn't feel immediate. It felt delayed, like something that should have come weeks earlier. Reporters gathered instantly at the bottom of the steps, microphones rising, cameras locking onto his face. "Marcus, how does it feel to be cleared? Do you forgive the officer? Will you file a lawsuit?" He paused before answering, not for effect, but because the weight of the past weeks hadn't fully settled yet. "I'm just glad the truth came out," he said calmly. No anger, no theatrics. That composure only deepened public sympathy. Beside him, attorney Linda Carver guided him through the media crowd toward a waiting vehicle. Once inside, the door shut out the noise. For the first time, silence returned. Marcus leaned back slowly, exhaling. "You held up better than most would," Carver said. He looked out the window. "I knew I didn't do anything wrong," he replied. "I just didn't know if that would matter." Carver nodded. "That's why the sting existed." He turned to her. "You knew?" "Not everything," she admitted. "But federal oversight had flagged Hargrove months ago. When your arrest happened, it accelerated their operation." Marcus absorbed that quietly, meaning his case hadn't just been about him. It had been the tipping point. Back at his apartment later that evening, reality hit differently. The door creaked open to a space untouched for weeks. Mail stacked on the floor. Utilities notices. A silence that felt heavier than the jail cell he'd left. Wrongful arrest didn't pause life. It disrupted it. He walked to the kitchen, opening an empty refrigerator. Groceries gone, food spoiled, routine broken. His phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls, messages, interview requests. Then one message stood out. Unknown number. "Thank you for exposing him. My brother was arrested by that same officer last year." Another message followed, then another. By nightfall, dozens had arrived, strangers sharing similar encounters. Illegal searches, false charges, dismissed cases. Marcus sat down slowly, reading them one by one. Each message expanded the scope of what had happened to him. He wasn't isolated. He had been one name in a pattern. The next morning, Carver met him again. This time not at court, but at a civil litigation office downtown. Folders covered the conference table. Gasefiles. Victim statements. Internal reports. "We're filing a federal civil rights lawsuit," she said directly. Marcus looked at the stack. "That many?" "That's just preliminary," she replied. "Once the investigation goes public, more will come." He sat down, processing the scale. "This isn't just about clearing your name anymore," Carver continued. "It's about accountability." He thought back to the night of the arrest, the planted bag, the handcuffs. Then to the courtroom screen exposing it all. "What happens to him?" Marcus asked. Carver didn't sugarcoat it. "If the charges stick, prison, federal." Marcus nodded slowly, not satisfied, not vengeful, just understanding, because the damage done to him had been multiplied across others. And now, as lawsuits formed and testimonies gathered, the case that began as one false arrest was turning into a systemic reckoning. 2 weeks after the courtroom sting, the federal indictment came down. It didn't arrive quietly. It arrived in the form of a sealed grand jury decision, one that federal prosecutors unsealed in a packed press briefing room. By then, Officer Daniel Hargrove had been held in federal custody pending review. No uniform, no badge, no departmental protection. Just a defendant number. Inside the federal detention facility, he sat across from his court-appointed defense attorney, reviewing the indictment document line by line. The charges were heavier than he'd expected. Much heavier. Count 1, civil rights violations under color of law. Count 2, evidence tampering. Count 3, perjury. Count 4, obstruction of justice. Then the expanded counts followed, each tied to reopened arrests now under federal review. 6 cases, becoming 9, with more pending forensic audit. Hargrove dropped the file onto the metal table. "This is excessive," he muttered. His attorney didn't sugarcoat reality. The Reed footage made this prosecutable at the federal level. Once that happened, every prior arrest became reviewable evidence. He leaned forward. "They're not just trying to convict you, they're trying to make an example." Hargrove looked away, jaw tight. For years, he'd walked into courtrooms as the state's witness. Now he was the one awaiting trial. Across the city, the announcement triggered a media storm. News networks ran split-screen coverage, courtroom sting footage on one side, Hargrove's mugshot on the other. Headlines rolled non-stop. Federal grand jury index officer in evidence-planting case. Civil rights probe expands beyond single arrest. Wrongful convictions under review. Civil rights organizations held press conferences demanding departmental reform. Protests gathered outside police headquarters, not violent, but loud, organized, relentless. Marcus Reed watched much of it from his living room, the television casting flickering light across the apartment. It felt surreal. Weeks earlier, his face had appeared on screens as a criminal suspect. Now those same networks labeled him key witness in federal police corruption case. His phone rang Attorney Carver again. "The criminal trial date's been scheduled," she said. "When?" "6 weeks." Marcus exhaled slowly. "And I testify?" "You're the central victim witness," she confirmed. "But you won't be alone. Federal investigators, prior victims, even departmental supervisors may be called." The scale kept growing. This wasn't just about a planted bag anymore. It was about institutional failure. Inside detention, Hargrove received notice of the same trial date. He read it twice. 6 weeks. Time that felt too short to rebuild a defense, but too long to sit with the weight of exposure. That night, alone in his cell, the silence pressed harder than interrogation ever had. No media cameras. No investigators. Just his thoughts replaying the footage on an endless loop. Patrol car door opening. Hand retrieving the bag. Placement beneath the seat. He closed his eyes tightly, but memory didn't stop. Because for the first time, he wasn't preparing testimony. He was preparing survival. And as federal prosecutors finalized their witness list, one thing became clear. The courtroom where he once held power was about to become the place where that power would be permanently dismantled. 6 weeks later, the federal courthouse stood under tighter security than usual. Barricades lined the steps. Media crews filled the outer plaza. Satellite vans stretched down the block, proof that this wasn't just another criminal trial. This was a national spectacle. Inside courtroom 2A, the atmosphere felt heavier than the earlier hearing where the sting footage had first played. This time, Officer Daniel Hargrove didn't enter through the side witness door. He entered through the defendant's entrance escorted by U.S. Marshals, wrists cuffed in front of him. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed. Spectators whispered as he was seated beside his defense counsel. Gone was the pressed uniform. Gone was the badge. He wore a plain Navy detention suit, identity stripped to procedure. Across the aisle, Marcus Reed sat beside federal prosecutors and civil counsel, posture straight, expression composed. Their eyes met briefly. Hargrove looked away first. Judge Eleanor Whitman presided, again reassigned due to her familiarity with the original case exposure. Her presence reinforced continuity. This trial wasn't separate from the sting. It was the consequence of it. United States versus Daniel Hargrove, the clerk announced. The charges were read aloud, each count echoing through the silent courtroom. Civil rights violations. Évidence fabrication. Perjury. Obstruction. Each word chipped further at the image Hargrove once carried. Jury selection had already concluded, days earlier. 12 citizens now seated in the box, notebooks open, expressions serious. They had all seen the footage before trial, unavoidable given national coverage. But now they would see everything else. Opening statements began. The federal prosecutor stood first, calm, methodical. "This case is about power abused under the color of law," she said. "A badge used not to protect citizens but to manufacture criminals." She walked slowly before the jury. "You will see video evidence, forensic audits, and witness testimony proving the defendant systematically planted evidence to justify unlawful arrests." She gestured toward Marcus. "And you will hear from the man whose wrongful arrest exposed the pattern in real time." Defense counsel rose, next tone measured, but strained. "Officer Hargrove served 12 honorable years," he began. "We do not dispute the video raises questions, but questions are not proof of systemic misconduct," he emphasized. "Human error, procedural misjudgment, context missing from selective footage." But the argument felt thin even before evidence began. Then came the prosecution's first witness, Marcus Reed. He walked to the stand slowly, swore the oath, and sat. The prosecutor approached gently. "Mr. Reed, describe the night you were arrested." Marcus spoke calmly, same composure he'd held since the beginning. "Routine stop. Compliance. Search. Denial of ownership. Handcuffs." He didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. He didn't need to, because the jury had already seen the footage that confirmed every word. The prosecutor asked the final question. "How did it feel watching that video in court?" Marcus paused. The room stilled. "Like my life almost got rewritten by someone else's lie," he said quietly. The words landed deeper than any legal argument. Hargrove stared at the table, because this time he wasn't testifying to control the narrative. He was listening as it dismantled him piece by piece. And the trial had only just begun. By the 4th day of trial, the courtroom atmosphere had transformed from tense to suffocating. Every witness called by the prosecution added another layer to the case against Daniel Hargrove. Federal forensic analysts testified first, confirming the evidence bag from Marcus Reed's arrest contained no fingerprints except Hargrove's. Then came internal affairs supervisors revealing prior complaints, procedural flags, and disciplinary warnings that had never reached criminal threshold until now. Each testimony chipped away at the defense narrative of isolated error. But the turning point came when the prosecution rested, and the defense made a decision that shifted the courtroom's energy instantly. They called Daniel Hargrove to the stand. A quiet murmur passed through the gallery as he rose from the defense table. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The officer who once testified with confidence, now testifying for his own freedom. He swore the oath, voice lower than before, and sat. His attorney approached carefully. "Officer Hargrove, did you intentionally plant evidence in Marcus Reed's vehicle?" Hargrove exhaled slowly. "No." The answer came firm but lacked the authority it once carried. "Then explain the footage." He adjusted slightly in his seat. "The angle is misleading. I retrieved the bag from the vehicle during search. The video doesn't capture the full sequence." The attorney nodded, guiding him gently. "Did you ever intend to violate Mr. Reed's civil rights?" "Absolutely not." "Have you ever planted evidence in any arrest?" "No." But as the word left his mouth, even some jurors' expressions hardened not from bias, but from the weight of contradictory footage already burned into their memory. Then came cross-examination. Federal Prosecutor Elena Vasquez approached calm, precise, relentless. She didn't begin with Reed's case. She began with pattern. "Officer Hargrove, how many narcotics arrests have you made in your career?" "Over 200. "And how many involved vehicle searches?" "Most." She displayed a chart on the courtroom monitor, reopened cases, highlighted in red. "Are you aware 9 of those arrests are now under federal review?" "I've been informed." "Coincidentally, each involved body cam malfunctions." Hargrove shifted slightly. Technical failures happen. Vasquez stepped closer. Do technical failures also remove fingerprints from planted evidence? Defense objected. Overruled. The question hung unanswered. Then she played the read footage again, but slowed, zoomed, enhanced. Frame by frame, patrol car, bag retrieval, concealment, placement. The jury watched in absolute silence. She paused the frame where the bag touched the car floor. "Is that your hand, officer?" He hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. "Yes." "And that bag came from where?" "The vehicle." She cut him off sharply. "From your patrol vehicle." Silence detonated across the room. Hargrove's composure cracked visibly for the first time. His breathing changed. His eyes flickered toward the jury, then down. Vasquez delivered the final blow quietly. "Power didn't shield you that night, officer. Cameras saw what you thought no one would. No further questions." He stepped down from the stand slower than he'd walked up, because in that moment, the authority he once carried into courtrooms had been replaced by exposure he couldn't outrun, and as closing arguments were scheduled for the next morning, everyone in the room felt the same approaching gravity. The verdict was no longer a question of if, only when. The courtroom was fuller than it had been at any point during the trial. Every seat taken. Media lined the back wall. Even officers from Daniel Hargrove's former department sat quietly in the gallery, not in support, but in witness to the outcome. Because this verdict wasn't just about one man. It was about what his badge had represented. Hargrove sat at the defense table, hands clasped tightly, detention uniform creased from restless nights in custody. Gone was the arrogance that once defined him. In its place sat exhaustion, and the slow realization of consequence. Across the aisle, Marcus Reed sat beside federal prosecutors and his civil attorney, posture straight, expression steady. He hadn't come for revenge. He'd come for truth to be finalized. Judge Whitman entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. "Be seated." Her voice carried the same measured authority as always, but today it felt heavier. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor." The silence that followed felt endless. The clerk accepted the document and handed it to the judge. She read it briefly, then returned it. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the paper, voice clear but solemn. "On count 1 civil rights violations under color of law, we find the defendant guilty." A breath moved through the gallery. "On count 2 evidence tampering guilty. Count 3 perjury guilty. Count 4 obstruction of justice guilty." Each word struck like a gavel of its own. Hargrove didn't react outwardly, but his shoulders lowered slightly, as if the weight had finally settled where denial once stood. The judge nodded once. "Thank you, members of the jury." They were dismissed. As sentencing proceedings began immediately, federal prosecutors having requested expedited judgment due to the public trust breach. Judge Whitman addressed the courtroom. "Officer Hargrove, you were entrusted with authority meant to protect citizens, not fabricate crimes against them." She paused, ensuring her words carried full weight. "Your actions not only wrongfully incarcerated an innocent man, they undermined public trust in the justice system itself." Hargrove stared forward, unmoving. "This court finds your conduct deliberate, repeated, and abusive under color of law." She reviewed the sentencing document briefly. "On combined federal counts, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, with eligibility for review after 10. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Not celebratory, just resolved. The gavel struck once final. As U.S. Marshals stepped forward to escort Hargrove away, he glanced once across the room toward Marcus. Not defiant, not angry, just aware of the irreversible shift between them. Marcus held his gaze briefly, then gave a small, controlled nod. Not forgiveness, not triumph, acknowledgement. Because justice, for him, had never been about humiliation. It had been about truth being seen. Weeks later, civil settlements followed, wrongful convictions were overturned, and departmental reforms were implemented under federal oversight. But the defining image remained the same: a man once framed in handcuffs, walking free, and the officer who framed him, walking into prison under the weight of the very law he had abused.